Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our next Ripple Ventures Tank Talk with Susan Su to discuss startup tips for growth, branding, and strategic partnerships. Thanks so much for joining us, Susan.
Hey, everyone. It's awesome to be here.
Just a quick background on Susan. Susan is the head of portfolio growth and marketing at Sound Ventures, where she helps Sound's portfolio companies win through growth, brand, and strategic partnerships. Prior to that, she was growth marketing for startups at Stripe, and she was prior to that head of marketing at Reforge. She was also a venture partner and marketer in residence for 3 years at 500 startups. And prior to that, she led content partnerships at AppSumo for a year. On the personal side, Susan graduated from Stanford University with a BA in history and is a member of the Stanford Symphony Orchestra that toured Carnegie Hall, Oxford, and the Sorbonne. Susan, I'd love to kick things off and discuss about your operator journey. Can you tell us about your journey in starting working in product and marketing leadership at some of these well-known startups? And what lessons did you learn while working for these companies?
Yeah, I think the main thing that I want to say about the journey is that while it's very easy, hindsight 2020, to look back and sort of impose intentionality onto some of the things that we do in our life, in reality, a lot of these kind of like milestones or pit stops on the journey are, fortunate coincidences. And so just wanted to put that out there as like, in your early 20s, you're not necessarily as directed as you want, but I had really, really good outcomes and really good results just from being in the right place at the right time. So just don't want to take too much credit for that myself. I will say tons of lessons learned. So at Google, I was working on localization for Google's geo products, Google Earth, Google Maps, and back in those days, there was a 3D sketching product as well. And my biggest lesson there was really not only sort of like, the basics of working in a large tech company and with distributed organizations and crazy competing timelines, but also, sort of like the headline lesson was really just that localization opens up markets. We know that now, and yet I still see many early stage companies don't practice it. It's sort of this trope that the English speaking markets, US and North America, are where the money's at. And I think maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, that was very, very true. I think today that really needs to be revisited and revised. I think it's no longer true, and Google working on localization was really where I saw the early investment that company made in localization and how that paid off going forward into like their global domination strategy that they rolled out since then, because that was a long, long time ago that I was at Google. At High Five, which probably nobody here knows what High Five is, but it was a social network and social gaming platform back in like the late 2000s that also was primarily focused on markets outside of the US. So at High Five, I learned the exact same thing, like, wow, much more in touch with, there are so many users and there's so many different sort of pockets that are, at that time, were still really kind of blossoming in Southeast Asia, in LATAM, and in other parts of Europe. And now we see those markets really come into their own and become their own centers of gravity. And so that was a really great lesson from High Five, was like, hey, pay attention outside of the US. The other thing that I learned on a personal level at High Five, I was a product manager at High Five. I was a very, very, very junior product manager / paper pusher between the engineers and other engineers and other PMs. And what I learned there was that I really wanted to be closer to the customer. I care a lot about marketing, and I wanted to be talking to or thinking about customers every single day. So when that company ultimately went its way, my next move, I knew, was to get into marketing. Fast forward, actually, the intersection of marketing and product and eventually became what we call growth today. So it was very fortuitous. At Inside Network, which was a media startup that ultimately had a successful exit, I really learned, and in that category, this is very salient, I learned the value of brand and how intangible and immeasurable it is, and yet precious ultimately for not only customers and especially enterprise customers, but for exit outcomes. They're buying your IP. They're not necessarily just buying your book of business. And then also we did a ton of content marketing. That entire business was a content marketing business. So that's really where I kind of started getting some of my early content marketing chops. And then at AppSumo, I learned email marketing because we were mailing to a massive list. That was our main revenue driver. We did high velocity, high volume multivariate testing. So learned a lot of the value around that and learned there that the offer is everything. We use that offer on ads. We use those offers to bring people into the email list. And then we were able to continuously, really drive LTV from the initial offer. The initial offer is the filter that determines not only how much revenue are you going to get today, but even what type of customer you're bringing in and what their potential LTV is going forward. That's all lives inside the offer.
Wow. It sounds like you had such a natural progression towards growth marketing. Totally, unplanned, like you said, very fortuitous. And, you starting off at Google and seeing the localization, the grassroots approach to building product, launching product, and then moving through to High Five and over to AppSumo eventually, you kind of saw how growth marketing became its own beast because of how fragmented certain aspects of the business were that needed to be brought together through product and marketing. That's incredible. And then would you say that, 10, 15 years ago, when maybe only Google thought about localization, now it's become more mainstream for some larger companies, that it's at a certain stage where you have to take on that challenge, or even very early stage companies should be thinking about localization when they're trying to launch in different markets, even if their product is still trying to find its way in, let's say, an English speaking country?
Yeah, I don't think that localization precedes product market fit. And I think that a lot of early stage companies assume that they have product market fit when really they found something that kind of works. It's an early glimmer of product market fit. But to me, true product market fit is not only you have a product that customers want, but there's a substantial number of those customers and you have a proven way. So, you have something that some people want. 2, there's a substantial number of those people that want your thing. And then 3, you actually have a way to reach them that makes sense with your business model. Mm-hmm. So, for example, you might want to build an e-commerce business, but a reality that you're going to have to face is that a lot of e-commerce businesses are going to rely 70% on advertising in order to drive customers to the product, to connect the product to the customers. That's their channel. Now, if your business model is structured in a way that you can't afford advertising at the current rates and velocity and volume that you need to, then that means you don't have product market fit. Just because people want your thing doesn't mean that you have product market fit. You really have to speak to that channel and that business model piece. And I am going to fully give credit to Brian Balfour for that, because he has recommend everybody check out. Just Google 4 Fits Brian Balfour or Product Channel Fit Brian Balfour. He has a really, really great series all about how all of those different pieces need to fit together, not just your product and your market. And so back to the localization question, if you haven't really figured out and you don't feel confident in, okay, we have these customers, there's this many of them, and here's this reliable way that is affordable for us to reach them, then no, absolutely, it's not time to go after new markets yet, because a new market, a new language market is a new market of people. And that's going to require rejiggering on the value proposition, the way that you express that value proposition, and also the dynamics of the channels that you use to reach those people. Every market that's a geo market has a little bit of a different channel mix.
Yeah, well, that's amazing insight, and we'll definitely get into that. But let's move on to your role at 500 Startups, where you spent over 3 years as a venture partner and the marketer in residence, where you launched and operated a 10-week advanced accelerator program, among many other roles. What achievements are you most proud of during your time at 500, and what impact did you have on the accelerator's approach to growth?
Thank you so much for asking this question. I loved 500 so much. I love 500 still very, very much. And I think the reason and the biggest lesson I learned from 500, and something that is an ethos that I really live by today, is that to me, a startup isn't just a different type of financial asset. Okay. And maybe that makes me not a good VC or whatever, but to me, it's not a financial asset. It is, but it's not only that. More than that, it's someone's dream. So the proudest achievement that I had at 500 Startups is actually a string of little achievements. It really is about making it easier, making it make sense for people to build their dreams so that other people can get value from those dreams in the real world. That is probably the biggest, sort of like group of achievements, is really like day in and day out, getting to work with our entrepreneurs, getting to work with founders from all kinds of different backgrounds, and helping them to make their dreams a reality. I know it sounds kind of fuzzy, but I will say that, 500 Startups was life-changing for many, many people. It continues to be to this day. And part of that is due to 500's commitment to diversity, which precedes everything that's happening today. And it's not even like a commitment to diversity in that sort of like corp speak PR type of sense. It's really deep. Like it goes to that is who 500 is. And it's not just racial diversity, it's not just gender diversity, but also language, nationality, thought, approaches, backgrounds, income backgrounds. I think one thing that we never talk about, because it's a dirty little secret in Silicon Valley, is that a lot of entrepreneurs do not come from low income backgrounds, because it is hard to start a company if you don't have income security or you don't have a family that you can fall back on. And so one of the proudest things at 500 is that about 500, but also the fact that I got to support so many people from so many different backgrounds to actually go and build their dreams.
Yeah, it sounds like you were really like an enabler for a lot of people who didn't get the chances to start companies on their own, and you believed in that personal connection and that human connection to building companies was more than just looking at it as an asset class, which some investors purely do, who may come from Wall Street or some sort of business background. But if you come from a startup background, there's a lot more that happens behind the scenes than just markups and valuations and IRRs.
Well, and especially at the early stages, none of those things are relevant yet. And like there's literally there are no numbers on the spreadsheet to diligence. So at that point, at that stage, we really are talking about like the 0 to 1 or like the 1 to 10 kind of problem. And what's really fun about getting to actually enable people on the human level is that what you realize is that, like, Matt, you and I, like, we have access to so many experts. If you had a question about, I don't know, Facebook ads, I'm sure you can think of immediately, you already probably thought of somebody that you could go to. Mm-hmm. Most people don't have that. And what was really special about 500 is bringing in people that didn't have that and pairing them with people that did have that and seeing what could happen. And realizing that you don't need to have a huge bench of connections and network in order to be successful if we can plug you in to a system where that already exists.
Yeah, I try to explain to people the difference between late stage and early stage. And I try to say, well, late stage is kind of paint by numbers. You just kind of have to fill in the certain parts and it kind of works itself because you have all the data, you have all the numbers. But at the early stage, it's just a blank canvas. You can do whatever you want with some of these early stage companies because it's all yet to be written. So you have to have that connection and that enablement for a lot of them. But that's awesome that you are so proud of those achievements there at 500. So moving on to Reforge, where you built and led the growth marketing team for their education and training programs to top tech companies like Facebook, Airbnb, Uber, Slack, Amazon, and many others. What mistakes did you make while leading this team that you rely on today as a growth expert?
Well, Reforge, I was the first person to join after Brian. So definitely tons and tons of mistakes made all around, as well as tons of things done well and done right, as evidenced by where the business is at today. So I would say that probably my biggest learnings was around the need to test your full funnel and not take any of those kind of junctures, those connections between steps in your funnel for granted. And I'll tell you a story that will, kind of make that a little bit more real. So our second year building Reforge, we realized that there was a lot of traction around these kind of newsletters that we were sending out for our program alumni. And they were like these short, kind of snappy analysis pieces. And we thought, like we also at the same time saw the rise of the news site Axios, which you're probably familiar with. Again, taking like kind of long, complex news, distilling it into short kind of sound bites, and then giving people headlines around why does this matter? Why is this important? Really leaning into the fact that there's a use case around how we consume content, which is on our phone. We're probably not this year, but before we were like commuting to work, so we were like on our way somewhere. We needed to be friendly for that format and for that sort of time format. And so as a result of that, we came up with this idea to build a growth product. We built an entire separate microsite called Reforge Brief. We didn't, by the way, we did some early testing to validate it. It seemed like there was a lot of traction around the actual product. People were really interested in it. People were signing up for the email list. But what we realized was that it turns out people who read short, snippy analyses on growth, people who read Reforge Brief, are not necessarily going to be qualified for purchasing a $3,500 program. And now it sounds like super obvious, but this is one of those, I'm not embarrassed to share it. Growth people, it's all about learning really obvious lessons. It's kind of like we have to get hit over the head over and over and over again before we finally realize. But, or you have to sort of do it yourself to realize that, yes, that also applies on my audience. Yes, that also applies to my product. We sort of have to go through the pain ourselves to really integrate it. And I will say that, what we realized was that really illustrates the disconnect between some types of intent and the ultimate action that you want. just because people are really, really interested in our content, which the reason why we thought that it would work was because most of our leads had been driven by content marketing previously, but on our blog, really long form format, and it was really difficult to produce, and it was impossible to produce at the velocity that we wanted in order to meet the lead velocity that we wanted. So we came up with this like shorter, snippier idea. It turns out that that just didn't cultivate the same demand intent at the bottom of the funnel. And that was the really big lesson there. I've seen other businesses that have tried to do the same thing with content. So building out content funnels into an e-commerce purchase, for example. And I've seen that also not work, even though in theory, it should totally work. And that's just simply because until you actually get a transaction, you didn't get a transaction. In some senses, nothing proves purchase intent like a purchase itself. And so not over relying on those other leading signals, and certainly not investing in building out entire products to generate those kind of leading signals, because again, nothing demonstrates purchase intent like a purchase.
Yeah, and there's also nothing worse than having a marketing team think that these are their metrics that matter most, and then the sales team has completely different metrics, and there's just no alignment between them. There needs to be a connection through the entire pipeline journey, from top of funnel all the way to the bottom. And if someone's like, well, I hit my metrics from marketing perspective and growth hit theirs, but sales didn't hit theirs, like, how is that possible? They all need to kind of flow together and be completely aligned. And it sounds like, you were believing that this was the right way to go through. And then you had to take, a couple of hits over the head and said, okay, this is not going to translate into a sale or some type of closure. We need to realign ourselves from the top down.
Yeah. And I'll say one other complexity with Reforge is that it's a cohort-based application process. And so we weren't able to tell earlier than on application window whether or not those leads would ultimately translate into customers. And so that made it even more complex, because then you do have to sort of make this upfront marketing investment, not knowing whether or not ultimately, basically whether or not that lead is truly qualified. And we didn't have a sales team, so it was all self-serve. But at Stripe on the enterprise side, sometimes you can, the marketing team, totally know what you're saying, Matt. Like the marketing team's like, but we did our MQLs, marketing qualified leads. Here they all are. They meet all of our criteria for being a marketing qualified lead, literally as the name says. And then sales is over here like, we can't accept these leads. They're not good. They're not going to work for us. Like, we can't close these leads. It's garbage in, garbage out, So I think, everybody really needs to get on the same page as to what are those profiles and what are those criteria that really means if a lead is qualified or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, moving on to the venture side. So you joined Sound Ventures last year as head of portfolio growth and marketing, helping Sound's portfolio companies win through growth, brand, and strategic partnerships. What made you want to join the team at Sound, and what excited you most about working with Ashton, Guy, and Effie?
What made me want to join Sound? I mean, I think it's almost self-explanatory. It's just like, but I'll tell you, for me personally, I'd been working in tech companies for quite a long time by that point, both on consumer, B2B, enterprise. And I sort of, by then, it felt like I knew a little bit where I was headed. And it was a fine place, but I was also personally ready for something. I was ready to change things up. And when Sound came knocking, it immediately struck me as an opportunity to put myself in the center of a huge, and please take this in a good way, in a huge traffic accident. Or maybe think about it as like Indian holiday of Holi, where like people are doing the colors. Like, I wanted to be in the middle of that, and I wanted to get all the colors on me. What I mean by that is things that don't normally go together, when you put them together, can often create unexpected, unforeseeable, and almost always great outcomes. I personally love risk, and I personally love change as well. And so I was really ready for that. And I think Sound's unique position at the intersection of startups, venture, and also media and entertainment was that collision. It was like all of those colors in one, and I wanted to see where it would lead. So very, very qualitative. That is what made me want to join Sound. I love, startup founders and working with startup founders in the startup ecosystem. There are, of course, a number of ways you can do that. You don't have to join a VC. But the reason why I joined this VC was because of that really special kind of place where Sound sits. That's unlike any other venture fund out there.
That sounds amazing. amazing. Great opportunity, obviously. Who did you meet first and sort of what lured you in, I guess, to the team?
I was up in San Francisco, so I didn't meet anybody initially. And I met, when I went down for the meeting, I met everybody at once. So that was sort of a big, kind of group session. And what lured me in was really just, I realized that Guy and Ashton know their shit. Effie is incredible at bringing everything together, but Guy and Ashton know their shit in a way that goes so far beyond the Forbes articles, so far beyond the headlines. And I realized that there was a lot that I could learn from these people, that I was not going to be doing the teaching in this situation at all, that I was going to be doing a lot of listening and a lot of growing. Guy has built his career really reinventing others' careers and building global multi-decade brands, which is not easy. It's really not easy to do in entertainment. It's not easy to do in technology either. And just spending just a couple of my first few minutes with Guy, I realized, oh my gosh, there's a whole world that I don't understand. And that I certainly am not a master in. And so that was what really lured me in, was the opportunity to get so much better in areas that previously I didn't even know existed.
Right. And you got to see actually like real work was being done behind the scenes, and there was a lot of building still happening. And there was not just like this, hey, we're, Guy and Ashton and Effie throwing out checks. We're really hands-on with the companies. And I've seen that even just in some of the, conversations I've had with you and your partners and the companies you've looked at in our portfolio. You really do take a keen interest in understanding the businesses and the market and the brand and where they're building. So, maybe we can move on to that and some of the tips along the way for growth and branding and strategic partnerships that you focus a lot of your time on. So given that you were in-house growth operator and growth advisor for startups, what have you learned doing both roles, and how has that impacted the way you operate now as an advisor for growth at a venture fund?
So I think that as an operator, and I love being an operator, I would say as an operator, you have all the control, but you don't have all the context. So the key there is really to widen your perspective through your network and to also widen your network at the same time. It's very easy embedded in a company to get sort of tunnel vision on the company. And because you have to, look, if you're a founder, if you're a part of the founding team, or even if you are just a leadership employee at a later stage company, it demands that you give it your all, right? I mean, it's a startup of any stage. And so that can often lead us to have a little bit of that myopia, because the myopia also helps us on the business. That's what gets us that control. But again, context. As an advisor, you have all of this context, but you have almost no control. So the key there is to really develop your skills of soft power, I call it, and influence. And that's really hard to do because you can't measure it. It's kind of hard to talk about. It's really hard to get feedback on. And so I think they're both challenging and rewarding in different ways. And what I encourage people who are operators that are thinking about being advisors is to, for sure, do it, because this is going to give you that context. But again, in order to actually get there, you have to show that you sort of have some of that perspective already. Otherwise, nobody wants you as their advisor. I also think that one other thing I'll just add here is that people think that being an advisor is giving advice. And I think a lot of times it's actually just being somebody who is interested to ask really good questions. As a founder, you don't always have people that want to just, everybody wants you to tell them what to do. Everybody wants you to have answers. But sometimes, what the moment calls for, especially like this year, is exploration. But the exploration is really hard to do on your own, and it's so much easier when you have a guide. And the questions are really the guide around that. I think one of the most valuable roles that an advisor can play for any company is being a really, really great and very deep listener. Listening in between not only the lines, but in between the words, and then using synthesizing all of that and synthesizing all that intel to ask questions that can guide the founders or team to reach their own conclusions. So I think there's a little bit of that too. It's not, I wanted to just be clear, it's not always just, telling, but you can't get them to do it. It's also sort of participating in that way.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Being a sounding board without having to just sort of give advice, but just be able to absorb it and then make them hear themselves, through your own questions back to them. so that they
Right.
understand what they're asking you for. That's a really good point. Well, I'm sure you've seen a lot of mistakes early stage companies are making through growth experimentation. Can you tell us some of the most common mistakes you see in that?
Yeah, so I think this question is best served by thinking about founders in two very general, very broad buckets. The first bucket is growthy founders. The second bucket would be non-growthy, just generally non-growthy. Now, growthy founders, they already know how to do all of this themselves. They're very sort of already kind of naturally experimental. They're naturally sort of lean into risk taking, and they may, as a con on that, end up neglecting other areas of leadership. For example, on culture, on team, on vision, and on investor relationships, which are actually really, really important to take care of. Now, and I'm not saying that it's like a dichotomy, like either or, either you're good at growth or you're good at culture, whatever. Like, not at all. None of those are mutually exclusive. But sometimes, if you're very, very good at growth, that can tend to, because most businesses, most startups demand so much of it, that can be quite consuming. And so some of these other areas can fall by the wayside. For non-growthy founders, so like maybe somebody who's really technical or who has deep vertical expertise, there's often no experimentation. That's the mistake on experimentation, is that there isn't any happening. They might think that they're doing experiments, but what I would call what they're doing is they're trying to get it right. They're trying a lot of different things because they're trying shots on one particular goal. In true growth experimentation, you're not only trying to find sorting through a dark room, trying to find the door, trying to find the right answer. You're actually trying to learn about the room at the same time. And that you count every discovery that you make in the room, like, oh, here's a chair, here's a desk, oh, here's the light, I can turn on the light. All of those discoveries are valuable, not just finding the door out. So that's kind of the way that I think about experimentation versus doing other efforts to try to find the right answer. And I think that that's actually a mistake. Like, look, it's a tension, right? Because you need to find the right answer as soon as possible, because you have to show traction. You have investors breathing down your neck, whatever else you're dealing with. But, in reality, growth requires a little bit of that tolerance, a little bit of that patience, and being okay with failures and actually embracing those as another learning, as opposed to an actual failure, so to speak. And just the second thing that I'll say there is that folks that have less experience with growth in general often think that growth is a playbook. So founders come in and their approach to growth hacking or growth experimentation or whatever it is that they just think, okay, I just need to figure out, I need to get the recipe, and then I need to put somebody in to go and cook this recipe for me. And that's all I need. And I'm in a hurry. I'm raising money over here. I'm trying to hire a sales executive over here. So we just need to get this going. For sure, I recognize all of those tensions, but growth is not a playbook. You need somebody who cares deeply about your business, ideally at the founding level, who is going to own that and think about that day and night, every single day of their lives until you get to the outcome that you're looking for. I think that there needs to be a founder that owns growth. You don't have to have a growth background. You don't have to be a growth person or have it in your title, but there needs to be a founder at the founding level, okay? Not at just the hiring in, and certainly not at the third party consultant or agency level, who owns growth, because growth needs to be that core to the business.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, given your background in product and in marketing and sales, how does someone in the growth hacking role appease all the people who are saying, well, we don't have that product, feature on the roadmap, and we don't have the budget and marketing to do this, and we don't have salespeople to go out and try and sell this? How do they do that when they're trying to build a blender of a million things to try and test out, when nobody is backing them up with the other features of the organization?
So I think there's two questions in there. One is how you get other people on board with doing things that aren't on a core roadmap. And two is, how do you do it by yourself? How do you run all those experiments? Starting with the first question, which is how do you actually get people on board? I think it really is, growth is such a unique and challenging role, specifically on buy-in. And I'm very happy that you asked about that, because that's one of the biggest challenges, is that most things that growth people want to do are not on the core product roadmap and do require some resources. And so I think a lot of this comes down to demonstrating what the impact, it's obvious, right? You need to demonstrate what the impact is going to be. But I also think that there's like a very important like sequencing element to things where you really want to think about how are certain outcomes going to impact your relationships horizontally and vertically within the company. And what I mean by that in concrete terms is you need to have early wins. Whether you're the founder and it's early wins in front of your team and your investors, or whether you're an employee and you need to have early wins in front of your manager and your team, or whatever it is, you need to have early wins. And ideally, those early wins touch as many people as possible, not just outside on the user base side, but as many teams or as many individuals within your company as possible, so that everybody can get a taste of like sweet taste of growth, so that everybody can like have get a little bit in touch with that. And so I would, really pick and choose my battles and try to say, I maybe would like even go around and say like, hey, what are the areas that are priorities for you? And how can we use growth to accelerate that? Like, I want to be an amplifier. I want to be an enabler, even within the organization. So I think that really helps on the buy-in. That doesn't have to be forever. Later, you can sort of like, as you get more room, you can sort of work more and more of your stuff onto the roadmap. But ultimately, it's all about human relationships, like getting our way in an org or in a company. And so I really think it's about massaging those relationships in the right way. Now, the second point, which is how do you get stuff done without a lot of resources, without an engineer and a designer, and I need this and I need that. Of course, we would all love to have our own designer. I would like to have a personal designer and a personal engineer. Actually, I could like probably think of many, many cool things for them to do, even like with me today. But that's not the reality, unfortunately. And I think that there, it's really thinking about getting very creative on what is a true minimum viable test. And every word there counts. Minimum viable. And it's a test. It's not a permanent thing. It's a test. And we're looking for minimum viability. Like, what is the least that I can do for this to give me the intel that I should invest more, as opposed to, I have this idea, it's going to require a lot of investment, but I have conviction around it. Okay, that's great. But like, how do we dial that back in a way that doesn't require, engineering, for example? Like, is there an off-the-shelf solution or tool that could sort of like give us at least the signal on this to tell us whether or not we want to go more? So that's kind of how I would approach both of those areas.
Yeah, I love that. You really tied it all together because, one, you have to make mistakes and you have to do a lot of experiments, but you have to do the minimum viable test, and you have to have a founder who believes in the strategy of growth hacking and understands that there are going to be a lot of mistakes with the experiments, but can justify it by saying, we took a minimum viable test approach to this. That is really important. I love how you tied that together so nicely. So, there are mistakes though, that people make, not just with growth hacking, but with hiring for growth. And it's one of the hardest things people try to figure out when they don't even know if they're ready for it. So, a couple questions here on hiring for growth. One, what background makes a good growth hire? Where do you even start looking for one? When's the right time to hire it? And what are some of the best questions for interviewing for a growth person once you actually look for one in a hire?
My answers to these questions vary based on who's asking, basically. But let's say that this is a venture-backed startup. A background that makes a good growth hire for a venture-backed startup, to be totally frank with you, and this is not going to be a very easy answer, is an ex-founder. My ideal kind of founding member of a growth team at the early stages of a startup is somebody that has a lot of their own hustle, enough of their own hustle that they tried something, failed, and they're ready to try other things again. Because that is, at the end of the day, that is what growth is. I think there's a lot of backgrounds, by the way, that can be fine for this. But if I had to just pick one, and if I were hiring for my own company, I would be looking to scoop up founders who were, maybe ready to join something that was had that product market, that had a little bit more legs behind it, but they have the chops, they can bring that part in. Where do you even start looking? I think the first thing is to start looking in your own network. And the reason why I say that, even if you don't have a network, is because it is really important to bring other people in your community on the journey with you. Hey, I need help. Hey, I'm doing this, because you never know who they know and who they could recommend. I also just think it's just the obvious stuff, right? I think you can do a lot with LinkedIn. There's 1,000,001 layoff lists floating around right now. I will just caution on the layoff list. Look, I think it's there's a really natural inclination to say oh, I want to hire somebody from the Airbnb growth team or from the Uber growth team, because those companies are famous for how they've done growth. And for sure, any individual that has been vetted by Airbnb or Uber or any of these companies is going to be just all around super high quality. hands down. But you also have to recognize that growth at Airbnb or growth at Uber is going to be so fundamentally different from growth that your company needs, that they're not really looking for a bunch of like crazy idea, creative type people to come in and try a bunch of experiments. They're looking for people who can operate systems that are, for the most part, working pretty well, but still need creative optimizations. So it's less of a 0 to 1, and it's more of like an optimization exercise. And then there's also quite a lot of specialization at those later stages. So I would just be really careful in thinking through, like, look, somebody who is a stellar performance marketing leader from Airbnb is not necessarily going to be the right media buyer for your startup, simply because the resource profile and the goals and the time frame around those goals is just a complete universe away. So that's just like one warning on the where do you even start looking question. When's the right time? I mean, look, I think that there are some things where you need to have a product. Of course, you need to feel like your product is in a really great place. If it's an enterprise product, then I fully subscribe to founder-led sales for the first X period until there's too much. Like, you want it there to be like overflow on prospects in your pipeline. This is on the enterprise side. If it's a consumer company, then I don't think growth should be, hiring is not really the verb that we're looking for so much as bringing in at the founding level, sort of what we were talking about before, where because it's so foundational, so fundamental to the business, it really needs to be deeply integrated into the earliest core processes as possible. One of my favorite questions actually for screening for a growth person, I have two. I have a question that I actually use right now in our kind of VC interview process. And then I have one that I am stealing from Nick Soman, who's currently the founder of a company called Decent, previously did growth at Gusto. So my question that I like to ask is, and because I'm very bullish on the Shopify ecosystem, I say, if you could open up any Shopify store, any kind of Shopify store of your own, what would it be and why?
Oh, I love that.
And the sky's the limit there, right? I've like heard every single type of answer, and it's so fun because people love to get to turn their creative wheels. And then it's also a really great way to have it be more of a collaborative question, but it's also a great insight into how they think.
And to go for any employee. It doesn't even have to be on the growth side. It could be, any type of role.
Exactly. It could definitely be in any type of role. I think on the growth side, I'd be looking to understand how much opportunity sizing figures in to their answer versus just, intuition or whimsy or personal interest or whatever else. And those things are all okay too. Like, I don't want to like say no to intuition and like personal affinity and all that stuff, but there needs to obviously it needs to be anchored in market sizing. And then the question from, that I'm stealing from Nick is actually, how do you growth hack a city? And specifically, how do you growth hack a city in the middle of the desert? And it's really fun also because you're just like, let's go. Let's see. What can we come up with? What are some of the ways that I would do this? And it's not just about random ideas, but specifically, what is the sequencing? Like, how does it all tie together? And what's the intelligence behind that sequencing? And then in terms of what I look for in a hire, I think it just goes to those questions exactly, which is deep curiosity and deep with like in all caps. Like, it really needs to be somebody that is voraciously curious, wants to understand not only their customer, but also, not just like who their customer is, but what drives them, and even like at what times of day, like what drives them now versus later, like what is the evolution of that customer, because no person is static. I'm not the same person that I was last week, neither are you, neither is our customer. So that's the first thing. The second thing kind of related to that is being a great listener. As opposed to just a great talker, 2 ears to listen, one mouth to talk, that whole saying. But I think that's really true here because they need to be listening not only to the ground, but also to customers, not only to customers, but also their team members, not only their team members, but also their engineers, not only their engineers, but also their other stakeholders that are a part of this process, which, because it's like so multidisciplinary and cross-functional, there's a lot of stakeholders. They need to listen in between the lines and even in between the words, as I like to say, which is, look, people self-report one thing, but they really mean something else. They need to love optimizing and finding shortcuts to make their job easier. Like if I see a growth person who's like, sitting, like leaning back in her chair, like putting her feet up on her desk, super lazy, but got everything done by 11 a.m., I would say, you're amazing. That's what we want. We want people who are looking for opportunities to get more efficient, not only in their own workflow, but also in growth processes. Like you want that sort of like hunger for constantly looking for a better margin on themselves. And just the final thing related to that is just being, having that kind of like flavor of creativity and being okay with iterating. So for example, if somebody were to answer the how do you growth hack a city question with something really creative and they said, oh wait, I want to go back, I actually have a new idea on that. That's what I'm looking for, is that kind of ability to spitball and iterate kind of live in real time.
Yeah, it's like taking all those, mini mistakes, if you will, like you said earlier on. But I love how you answered these questions because they all sort of connected together with, you have to have a growth mindset in your personal and your professional life at all times.
Yes.
And you can get that out of someone by asking them those questions with the Shopify store and building, a city in the middle of the desert. So I really do appreciate you sharing those insights. Now, you've been around growth and marketing for quite some time. And so I'm sure you've developed some tactics and some methods for growth. Where do you go for resources or learning, and what do you have in your growth tech stack today?
So I think that you've done an amazing job on this slide and just like basically outlining some of what there is. It's so proliferated now, Matt. If Matt had to make this slide with like all of what there is, it would actually literally be like it would be multiple slides and it still wouldn't fit because there's so much SaaS out there to support growth. And so actually my secret tool that I like the best of all of these is, and there are a number, like it doesn't have to be this particular brand, but this tool type is actually built with because I love going to somebody else's site that's either directly in that category or maybe has like some similarities in terms of the go-to-market profile, but is in maybe a different category, and just use my Chrome extension or maybe look them up on Built With and just see what all's going on here. What are they using? The best way to learn, don't read any blog posts about tools. They all are sending affiliate links, right? But what a product and what a site is actually built on, that is going to tell you, and like what pixels they have going and all of that stuff is going to tell you so much more than anybody would self-report. So that's one. And then two is kind of related and this only works so that's why it's number two, but is SimilarWeb, which is actually being able to spy on, and there's probably better tools out there for this, but I'm like stuck on SimilarWeb. They've retained me for life because they're in my browser and all of that stuff. But it's basically, lets you see the sources of traffic as far as, a third party can determine that a site has. And I think that's also really important because it gives you directionally, it gives you a directional sense of the mix. Don't rely on it for exact specifics because it's third party data. Like it's never going to be super precise. But it gives you directionally like, okay, this much is referrals, this much is organic search. Here's like some of the organic search terms. This much is paid search, whatever. Or like, oh, wow, Pinterest is like a really interesting source for this site that I wouldn't have expected. So I think for the most part, like on learning, and this kind of reminds me of like being in college, but they always tell you like, you want to go to the beginning of it, you want to use original stuff. And the most original stuff out there on growth is actual businesses that are out there doing it. And nowadays we have so many ways to like peek into what all they're doing. I think there's no excuse not to do that. And that's so much better than reading a blog post, like even like looking at G2, which is like a review site for software, like any of that stuff. And maybe even better than books, but we can talk about books in a second.
Yeah, well, it sounds like people's growth tech stacks are just going to get bigger and bigger after hearing some of those additions as well. All right, well, I'd love to move on to my favorite part of the talk, which are your book recommendations. And you have some amazing books here. So can you tell us about why you love these books and why our audience should listen to them?
Yes. So I think that if you had to pick just one book out of all of these, I would actually pick Thinking in Systems. It's my number one book recommendation of all time for so many reasons. It actually, I think, was sort of popularized in engineering circles, actually, but it also has like environmental implications and it has massive growth implications because ultimately when you're building growth for your company, you are building a system and you need to understand what a system is and how to diagram a system and how inputs and outputs work in relationship with feedback loops. And that's all kind of outlined in this book. It's very academic. So I would say say like, look, can you get through the first third? If so, you're probably good to go on that. And then if you really like it and you want to apply the philosophy elsewhere to your product or to your business, then yeah, like go for it, go for the whole thing. But I love that it takes, I think a little bit more of a step back and a very kind of philosophical approach to the work that we're doing when we do growth. I think it's really important to do that because rather than just going to kind of like what it reminds me of, Matt, is actually like, how there's like some people that will like major in marketing. Marketing is a major in some colleges. So you could major in marketing or you could major in philosophy. Would I rather hire a growth person that majored in marketing or that majored in, I don't know, like computer systems theory? I would rather hire a growth person that majored in computer systems theory versus majoring in marketing. Why? Because if you know marketing, then you know the stuff at the end. You know how to like push the buttons and pull the levers really, really well. You know the strategies and the tactics, fine. But when the business changes and potentially really dramatically, or when the macro environment changes potentially really dramatically as it has this year, are you going to be able to throw everything you know out the window and invent a new way of doing what you need to do? That's where thinking in systems is going to train you on those kind of mental models to be able to adapt to whatever changing environment that we're going to be moving into going forward. So that's why I love that book. Very big picture and theoretical. But then, it's really about you take that lateral learning and translate it into the practicalities of day to day. I love this Joseph Sugarman book, which I think might actually be out of print, but you can get it on Kindle, Advertising Secrets of the Written Word, because it is just like such an oldie but a goodie. It's way back in the direct response days, pre-internet. And sometimes I like to, in both of these cases, like you'll notice that none of these books have to do with like actual tactics for how you do growth online. Advertising Secrets of the Written Word was back when people would like do door-to-door sales and direct mail sales letters to a mailbox, to a physical mailbox. And that's how they would sell stuff, or catalogs. And so you say, like, how is that relevant to growth in the internet age? I think this is full of just like user psychology gold, really understanding the arts of persuasion and like also kind of the technical aspects of persuasion. So I think this book does a really, really good job of that. Plus it's kind of fun and retro because of like the way that he talks and things that they're talking about. So I find it like kind of a fun throwback, and it's like more fun to read in that way, and it has pictures and things. And then Ogilvy on advertising, why I love this book is because it's full of pictures. It's like a picture book. So here's one that you don't have to read very hard. And this one's just incredible for inspiration. Obviously, David Ogilvy is like an absolute legend. And it's funny that the Ogilvy firm right now, I feel like it's more known for PR and PR strategy, but actually, David Ogilvy is a master of positioning. And brand positioning is something that is so subtle and yet can make or break a business. It's so meaningful for startups, and it's something that is very, very hard for younger founders to grasp because you just don't have like that sort of experience. And so I think this book is a really great way to just see some examples of how it's been done for iconic brands. Again, this is an older book, so it's in the past, but I like that because then it allows you to sort of like depersonalize it. Like there's nothing triggering in here for people, so you can just study the stuff without like, getting pulled in a subjective way.
Yeah, these are awesome suggestions, and it kind of ties back to, going back to the original source of truth, especially with some of these older books like Ogilvy and Advertising Secrets. It's like these were the people who had to make it themselves from scratch.
Absolutely. Exactly. Yeah. Like he invented this stuff. Right. And then we have just been like deriving from it ever since.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we wrap things up, we always ask our guests for any final words of inspiration for our audience.
I just want to say my final word of inspiration here is that growth should be fun. We face a lot of pressure. We have to hit certain numbers, or we're trying to like keep the lights on. There are goals. There's certainly a lot of pressure around velocity. But at the end of the day, I think that if you're not having fun with growth, and if your growth team is not having fun with what they're doing, then it's trending to zero. Like that is what that retention curve looks like. And it's not just because you need to retain people and entertain them, but because the very spirit, like the core, like the heart of growth is really around creativity and experimentation, and actually sort of like quantitatively informed creativity, if that makes sense. I took an art class in college, my only ever art class, and they gave us really specific prompts for projects that we would make. And at first I thought, why are they, like, this is supposed to be art, this is supposed to be creative. Why are they giving us like so many requirements for every single project? And then I realized it's because the constraints actually unlock creativity, because they force you to do things in a way that's not just like the easy, lazy default. And so growth, tying that back to growth, I really think it's very crucial to lean into that creativity and to lean into the fun aspect of it. Because if it's not fun, then it's not going to sort of be the exploding light bulb. You know what I mean? Like, we need to think outside of the box. And in order to do that, we need to also be enjoying ourselves. So maybe not exactly what people thought, but like, how can you do growth and have fun at it? That's the key.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us in the tank today and sharing your wonderful words of inspiration and tactics and tips on growth and strategy for startups at the early stage. And thank you very much again for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.